Good evening, everyone. I'm Tom Miller, Director of the UCLA Debate Union here at UCLA. Tonight we're going to debate the subject of boycotts, divestment, and sanctions against Israel, also known as BDS. Is BDS moral? Is the motion before the House. Speaking affirmative and taking the position that BDS is not moral are Professor Judea Pearl and two student debaters, PHILLIPE, ASSOULINE, and Joseph KAHN. Let me quickly tell you a little bit about the people speaking against BDS and then tell you a little bit about the people speaking in favor of BDS. Judea Pearl is Chancellor's Professor of Computer Science and Director of UCLA's Cognitive Systems Laboratory, where he conducts research in artificial intelligence, human reasoning, and philosophy of science. He is a founding fellow of the American Association for Artificial Intelligence and an elected member of the National Academy of Sciences. In 2012, he won the Alan Turing Award, also known as the Nobel Prize of Computing. Following the murder of his son Daniel in February of 2002, he founded the Daniel Pearl Foundation, which fosters East-West understanding. A staunch supporter of the two-state solution, Pearl writes frequently on Middle East peace process and on Israel's image on campus. PHILLIPE ASSOULINE is completing his PhD in international relations and political psychology here at UCLA. PHILLIPE has taught sections on Middle East politics and Arab-Israeli conflict. His dissertation examines whether smart political communication can help bring Israelis and Palestinians closer to peace. He's also a lawyer and a political consultant, and he is presently conducting research in Tel Aviv. And the third young man to my right, sitting in the middle, is our debate team captain, UCLA debate team's captain, Joseph KAHN. He is a fourth-year political science and civic engagement student. He is a residence assistant and loves helping the residents get everything they can out of their UCLA residential experience. He plans on going to law school, and he has judged and taught debate at the college level for 4 years. Speaking on the negative side, or in favor of BDS, will be Professor Saree Makdisi and two student debaters, AHMAD AZZAWI and WALI KAMAL. Saree Makdisi is a professor of English and comparative literature at UCLA. Professor Makdisi received his BA in English and Economics from Wesleyan University and his PhD from Duke University. He is author of several books, including Romantic Imperialism, William Blake and the Impossible History of 1790s, Palestine Inside and Out, and Everyday Occupation, Making England Western, Occidentalism, Race, and Imperial Culture, and most recently, Reading William Blake. In the middle is AHMAD AZZAWI. He is a member of UCLA's debate union and represented UCLA at the 2014 National Debate Tournament at Indianapolis, Indiana. AHMAD studies sociology here at UCLA. He is interested in business and wants to work in the area of eliminating world hunger. WALI KAMAL is a fifth-year applied mathematics undergraduate. He is a project director for the Incarcerated Youth Tutorial Project, was president for the Muslim Student Association on campus and has been a writer and cartoonist for Al-Talib Student News Magazine. He has participated in conversations about BDS as a member of Students for Justice in Palestine and in avenues of student government when divestment resolutions were brought forth to USAC. Little preview. The debate will be broken down into 4 parts. The first part, we will begin with each speaker making an initial 7 to 9 minute submission, responding to each other. During this part, no questions or comments from the floor will be taken. In the second part, the debaters will have an opportunity to question each other. The third part will be the closing remarks from Professor Pearl and Professor Makdisi. In the fourth part, the floor will have an opportunity to ask questions to the speakers about BDS. Please note, since each side is obligated to answer your questions, the question must be directed to both sides of the House. To reiterate that point, your question cannot be directed to any one speaker, but to both speakers. And unfortunately, in this day and age, I must give this warning. In the interest of all sides of debate, as moderator, I would like at this stage to issue a ruling of the provision prohibiting conduct intended to disrupt this debate. I rule this provision includes a prohibition of any banners, posters, or other visual materials. UCLA is very committed to standards promoting speech and expression that fosters the exchange of ideas and opinions. While it is recognized that not everyone may share the same views as the speaker, it is expected that everyone in attendance at this event respect the right of the speaker and the organizing student group to share their perspective and ideas by not causing a disruption of the event's activities. At the conclusion of the event, there will be a question and answer session during which you may ask questions that apply to both speakers. Be sure to phrase your comments briefly in a short question. But now to the debate itself. A reminder to the audience that no questions or comments will be taken from the floor during this segment of the debate. So we will first turn to Mr. ASSOULINE for his initial submission.
Thank you for clapping, even though I'm the man who needs an introduction. Hello? I said thank you for clapping, even though nobody knows who I am. I'm going to put the timer because for ethnic reasons, I'm not good at stopping to talk. So thank you very much for hearing me out. Thank you to the organizers for having me. I take this debate very seriously, almost as a moral duty, and so I'm quite nervous, and I hope you'll bear with me. So the question is BDS moral? And I would submit to you that it is not. One judges a movement by the actions of its proponents. The movement to boycott, divest, and punish Israel's economy, its artists, its scholars, its singers, its writers, is perpetuated by people who would have you accept one extremist version of one fight as basic fact. It would have you accept one extremist interpretation of international law as the basis of common decency. And not only that, you will likely hear tonight, as you hear we all have seen on campuses, wild claims about what international law says about refugees, about settlements, about the occupation. Historical claims about how the Palestinian exodus occurred, about how Israel is fighting against terrorism, about how its society is built around its education, its communities, its racial relationships. A very caricatured and cartoonish version is going to be imposed on you as if it is the basis of fact, a version that preys on natural compassion and that weaponizes victimhood. You don't have to accept that version. I can assure you, it's not true, it's often untenable, and it's highly debatable. But if BDS were to win, you wouldn't be able to go check for yourself. You wouldn't be allowed to speak to Israelis and get their own perspective. Imagine if we were tasked here with arbitrating a custody battle, and yet we were not allowed to speak with the mother, we were not allowed to hear her legal arguments, we were not allowed to hear her version of events, we weren't allowed to meet her. Would that be moral? Would that be a moral way to come to a judgment about a war far away where both sides are suffering? Obviously not. But that's not the main problem with BDS, in my opinion. It's not procedural. The main problem is human. There's a very high human cost at this constant, selective, weaponized, misleading outrage. And number one is what it does to Israeli dignity. We often forget this. I am working on a political campaign for the liberal Labor Party in Israel right now. Candidate who wants a two-state solution, as I do, and is pushing for coexistence. I have fallen in love with Israeli society by being there. This sounds seditious based on what we've all seen on the news and what we see on our campuses. But Israeli society is made up of profoundly good and caring people. People who, like us, deal with the hardships of youth, well, not so much me anymore, who have to deal with anxiety and a world of social media where everything is documented. There is no more privacy and everybody's to be judged. A world where they have to struggle with an economy that doesn't serve them anymore. Where they have to worry whether they're going to have money, where they're going to be able to buy an apartment by the age of 35. They have to struggle with all these issues and terrorism and world hatred and having their friends die and surviving terror attacks. And they respond to it with incredible courage. By being positive and answering with hope and trying to deal with an impossible situation in the best way that anybody could expect of any Western or non-Western society. This is the Israelis I've seen up front. This is the Israelis that BDS does not want you to see. And I urge you, if you can go, go. But if not, speak to them. Know them. What BDS does is rob these people of their dignity. And that, too, is not moral. It robs people here of the chance to meet them and be inspired by them like I was. And I have decided, despite living in California and loving it, and in Canada and loving it there, minus the weather, that I want my children to grow up in Israel precisely because I want them to be around those kinds of role models. I know that sounds crazy, but I'm not crazy. I'm jet-lagged, but I'm not crazy. Israeli society deserves its dignity, and this blanket condemnation of these people is vile and immoral. And there's a cost on our campuses. One of the distinct privileges of my life has been to teach at this university a section on the Arab-Israeli conflict. And the best part was when I managed to make students who were pro-Israel defend the Palestinian position, and students who were pro-Palestinian defend the Israeli position. I got people to be closer together. Instead, the proponents of BDS, like SJP, go around telling every community that their enemy is Israel. And you can Google this right now. To Native Americans, they're also natives who've been ethnically cleansed. To Jews, they suffered the Holocaust. To black people, they're Black Lives Matter. To Irish people, they're the Troubles, etc., etc., etc. This is not intersectionality. This is weaponizing people's need for solidarity and depriving them of a much-needed ally. You don't have to agree with Israelis on everything. They don't agree with themselves on everything. But you need to be able to benefit from their experience, and they benefit from yours. And instead, they're being ostracized. And Jewish students are being forced to choose between pride in their people, due pride in their people, and acceptance on campus. And that too is not moral. Finally, as somebody who researches what brings Arabs and Israelis closer together, and who values it above all else, I left a career to do this. BDS makes peace less likely. It makes killing more likely. It tells one side, sit back, Don't compromise. The world will choke Israel into submission and suicide because the demands of BDS are for Israel to commit suicide. You want peace? You give people the courage to make compromise. You don't let them harden in irresponsible positions and wait for the other side to die. Thank you very much.
I thank Mr. ASSOULINE for his remarks, and I now look to Mr. KAMAL for his initial submission.
Hello, everyone. Please bear with me. I'm also terribly jet-lagged. So for my speech today, we'll be upholding the motion, or actually rejecting the motion, excuse me, that BDS is immoral. So the context in which this discussion comes about is one I think that has seen, at least on this campus, a little bit more relevance in the past few years, but it's one that definitely is still is pertinent. We see in a number of state legislatures the proposal and passage of legislation that penalize government contractors for their participants in boycotts against Israel. So at the very least, this discussion is topical, and I applaud the debate union for being willing to handle and tackle such a kind of sensitive topic with a lot of charged feelings surrounding it. But again, the context in which this exists more historically is surrounding the occupation of the Palestinian territories as a result of the Six-Day War, almost 50 years ago. Israel and several of its Arab neighbors were engaged in a war that lasted for 6 days, and the result of this was a quick and decisive victory for Israel in which they were able to capture and control the land that defines the political realities of today. The ensuing occupation, though, becomes about a little bit more than just land. The inhabitants thereof became subject to the control of occupation, and the status quo of occupation in Palestine and the Palestinian territories has persisted, punctuated with periods of violent conflict marked by continuous tensions that have flared time and time again. This occupation accompanies the implementation of security measures that have institutionalized and regularized mistreatments of Palestinians in what a lot of folks have feared will begin to resemble apartheid if it hasn't already. So much so that the then Secretary of State, John Kerry, made remarks to this effect. But what we haven't had so far is a clear definition of what boycott, divestment, and sanctions entails. In response to calls from Palestinian civil society organizations, a movement emerged that seek to promote the use of the tactics of boycotts, divestments, and sanctions against Israel and its entities that are engaged in human rights violations, or at least uphold them as it pertains to the occupation. And it accomplishes goals that have been laid out in several UN resolutions. Namely, though, there's three particular ones. The first is to end the occupation, to seek a just resolution to the refugee crisis, and to ensure equality for Palestinian citizens living within Israel. Of course, as with any movement, it's a diverse one in which there's a number of different views held, a number of degrees to which every single aspect is supported. So the level to which folks will engage in like economic and academic and cultural boycotts is one that certainly varies, but all of these participants are really unified by their overall goal of ensuring like human rights of Palestinians that have been disenfranchised as like under the current political reality. So the framework of this debate then becomes about what is the morality of advocating for BDS. We've somewhat laid out the, I guess really the background that sort of motivates people to pursue such tactics. So the moral imperative for us is one that really is about a code of morals and ethics that regulates the boundaries of what should be like acceptable action. It's a question of what ought we do. So the moral framework that we are operating under is one that is normative and has very clear and tangible ideas of right and wrong, in which we contend that, as with many humanist people who subscribe to those schools of ethics and thought, that every human is a human, and as such, each individual has fundamental rights. These notions of human rights are central in this discussion, and as a result of the progression of the conflict, we've seen the institutionalization of numerous inequities that have been carried out and implemented by Israel against the Palestinians. So thus, we would contend that these inequities would be objected to under the moral codes that we would thus define and will speak further about. So a few of the things that we're attempting to divest and boycott against are like settlement expansion, things like that. Since the peace process has began, we've seen like the settlement population increase manyfold. The separation barrier that deviates from the Green Line and cuts into what is regarded or might be regarded as Palestinian territory. Checkpoints that restrict the free movement of Palestinians in what is considered their own land. Israeli, various like degrees of Israeli control over such things as like water resources, et cetera, as well as the generations of refugees that have been produced by the conflict without any place to return to. So these indiscretions are specifically enabled by the state of Israel, and it's what we contend constitute moral violations. So, sorry, to quickly digress, is it 9 minutes or 7 minutes? 7, okay. Thank you. So the first point then that kind of fits within this entire framework that I've just laid out is that BDS is a logical and moral response to this. It's geared towards a movement that employs nonviolent principles-based action to pressure the end of such indiscretions. It focuses on putting pressure on the party that holds the most agency in the situation to do something about the realities on the ground. The fact of the matter is that Israel, as the very powerful and capable nation that it is, in maintaining the occupation, it also holds the most agency, and as such, it is why it has become a target for boycott. It's not something that's particularly driven by malice or dislike, but it's something that clearly has a measurable impact on the well-beings of Palestinians, and there's clear reasons why people are compelled to boycott. The other key thing about BDS is that it imposes a cost against entities that are engaged in these indiscretions and indignities against Palestinians. In the same way that governments seek action and sanctions against, for example, like Russia for its annexation of Crimea and the occupation thereof, the purpose of BDS is to make occupation less comfortable. Because as we see, the status quo has been in perpetuation for for almost 50 years now, coming up, I believe, this next month, if I'm not mistaken. So without imposing a cost, we cannot therefore expect the status quo to change without any sort of really push in that direction. Of course, there's the peace process that has many of the same goals, but in absence, I mean, we saw in 2014 the level of success that was had. So we cannot see that that this status quo would end any other way without such pressure being applied. Therefore, it is thus that I urge you all to reject the motion that BDS is immoral. Thank you.
Thank you. I thank Mr. Kamal for his remarks, and we will now turn to Mr. Joseph KAHN for his response to Mr. Kamal.
Can you hear me?
Pull it down a little bit.
Can you hear me? How's this? Good? Cool. I'd like to start just by thanking everyone for being here. I admire folks who go to see controversial topics discussed in a hopefully objective way. Hopefully people are going to learn something, they're going to have their minds changed, or if not, they're going to have their opinions complicated by what they hear today, which will help us get away from this dichotomy that often exists, not just on college campuses, but in society in general. One of the remarkable things that I've noticed is you have to be on one side or the other in this Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You are either pro-Israel or you are pro-Palestinian. What's unfortunate and what I think is missing is that people should be able to identify as pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli. This means pursuing a just two-state solution that views both sides as equally legitimate and having equal claim to that territory. So I think in any discussion of BDS, we have to be asking ourselves, what gets us closer to a two-state solution? Now, before getting into my arguments, I want to first address what Mr. Kamal said. And I thought he was very well-spoken, and I'm very happy to be debating against someone of that stature. So first, he noted that the occupation is a big reason for the BDS movement. So there's three responses I want to make to that. First, recognize that Israel only gained control of that territory after being attacked by Jordan in the Six-Day War. Israel told Jordan not to get involved, and they did, and Israel then took control of that territory. But what's more important is that on two separate occasions, most recently in 2000 and 2008, Israel tried to give back this land in a offering to the Palestinian Authority that was declined. There was no counter offer made. So I think that when we look at this, we have to also recognize Israel's history of giving back land has only led that land to be taken back by Palestinian forces, and then ultimately rockets are hailed into Israel. This happened when Israel in 2005 unilaterally withdrew from Gaza. This also happened when Israel in 2000 withdrew from southern Lebanon. So Israel's history then of giving back land is one that doesn't lead to peace, but rather more violence. So I want to bring two arguments to bear on the debate today. The first is that the BDS movement constitutes a form of collective punishment that is immoral. The second is that the BDS movement is a perpetual movement for the national suicide of Israel, and because their goals are not achievable, and as Mr. Kamal noted, they are very diverse and not everyone agrees what they are, this movement will continue to make sure that Israel is always a national pariah. So first, why is BDS a form of collective punishment that is immoral? So collective punishment is the idea that you are supposed to punish people even if they are not complicit in the actions that you may disagree with, right? So while the response likely from those who support the BDS movement is that, well, all Israeli businesses, or lots of them, and Israeli universities, and Israeli artists, and Israeli cultural commentators are all complicit in the type of oppression. Therefore, it only makes sense to try and boycott all of them. But this is patently false, and this is literally discrimination reified when you try to think of people as everybody is complicit in a certain bad action, everybody of a particular national origin are all complicit in these human rights violations. So that's the first thing to note, ultimately, is that it's a form of collective discrimination and collective punishment. And this is what Philippe was telling you about when he talked about the human cost of BDS, that it hits at the dignity of all Israelis, because they are, whether or not they support the occupation, whether they're against it, whether they support settlements, whether they're against it, they are being boycotted, their businesses are being boycotted, their academic work is being boycotted. This doesn't make them more likely to change, it's more likely to make them think that the international world is against them. This is why we need dialogue and we need compromise. So ultimately, this form of collective punishment is immoral. Second argument, then, is that the BDS movement is a perpetual movement for Israel's national suicide. It's important to note that you have to also examine movement not simply by the actions and the words of the people who are in it, but if its goals are achieved, what does that look like? So there are two that are very important, and Mr. Kamal talked about them both. One is the removal of the security barrier, and a second one is the right of return for approximately 7.5 million Palestinian refugees. So what happens if those things, if those goals are met? If the security barrier is torn down, Israel will be forced to go back to an era of history when they were subject to constant car bombings, suicide bombings, and terrorist infiltrations. That's why the security barrier was built, and they protected their civilization in that way. So dealing with the right of return, then, is if 7.5 million Palestinians can return to Israel proper, then it means that Israel can no longer remain a Jewish state because they are a democracy, because the number of Arab citizens would outnumber the number of Jewish citizens. So if this happens, then Israel ceases to exist as a Jewish state. So because the BDS movement results, if it succeeds, in Israel giving up its right to self-defense, to protect its citizenry how it sees fit, and the right to exist as a Jewish state, it is immoral. So a little bit then, to preview what Professor Pearl is going to talk about, is about the recent UC Regents statement of principles against intolerance to see whether or not the BDS movement qualifies as a form of anti-Semitic, anti-Zionism. What's important to note in this whole debate is that it's not just people on the Israeli side who are against BDS. You don't have to look any further than the president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, when he was speaking in South Africa in 2013, said unequivocally that he does not support the BDS movement. He knows it is antithetical to peace, it is antithetical to dialogue, it is antithetical to a two-state solution that leads to ultimately both people living peacefully side by side, which is the goal that the majority of people agree that we should be pursuing. So with that being said, I urge you all to consider the arguments presented today and come to your own conclusions. Thank you.
I thank Mr. KAHN for his remarks, and I now will call on Mr. AZZAWI for his response.
Good evening and welcome. So first, I'd like to thank John for presenting that argument very nicely and concisely and coherently. I'd like to begin by offering a framework for which we want to operate under. What we aim to do is to highlight specifically why occupation is bad and why BDS is the only response to deconstruct occupation or to eliminate the occupation. And that's pretty much the basis for our side, is that we want to look at occupation and the response and an appropriate response to occupation. Before I do that, I'll go ahead and offer a couple points of rebuttal to John, and then some of it will be weaved in the argument. So the first argument, or one of the arguments that he makes, a very prominent one, is about collective punishment. It's what collective punishment, what's failed to realize on the other side is that it's kind of a double-edged sword, because collective punishment is the question of it is begged when that is the core of the occupation. Why is the entirety? Why is Gaza and the West Bank? Why are these innocent civilians, innocent people? Why are they occupied? For the wrongdoings of a small minority of the small people. So we'd just like to redirect the question back over and say, we believe that collective punishment is wrong. We'd like to approach it in a very non-violent way, the most diplomatic way possible, and the most feasible way possible is through BDS, because we strongly advocate against violence, and we hope to come to negotiations and reach a plausible solution. Secondly, there's reason to believe that, this is still the counter argument, there's reason to believe that easing of security measures would lead to an improvement in overall levels of security. An article in the American Journal of Political Science, authored by Matt Longo, Daphne Canetti, and Nancy Haidt-Rubin of Yale, the University of Haifa, Tufts, measured the changes in sentiment among nearby Palestinians following the easing of checkpoints in the area. Palestinians who don't have to go through the checkpoint anymore were significantly less likely to support violence against Israel or the militant Islamic group Hamas. Palestinians who still had to go through a checkpoint became significantly more likely to support violence. Our aim here is to cut violence. We don't like violence, and sometimes we use the right to, the checkpoint argument to say we need to defend. We need defense. Actually, in turn, perpetuates violence. So it's kind of circular. It's a circular solution that we'd hope that gets resolved. So number one, my main point is that we want to look at why occupation is immoral. Now, in the world of political morality, universality is going to be used to weigh the morality of the actions that the nation must accept, that even if an action is right or wrong for others, it is right or wrong for us. And so by that statement of of Kantian philosophy of universality, we can come to agree that occupation is categorically bad because we just can't have all countries occupying each other. And thus, by definition, occupation is categorically immoral. Now, since we established that occupation is immoral, what is the only feasible response to ending the occupation? And what we're looking at, any response that doesn't result in major transgressions is ethically obligatory. So it means, when we say obligatory, it means not only that it's right to do it, but it's wrong if we don't do it. And here, at the end of the day, we want to eliminate violence and come to peace. Now, there are two options. We either have a violent or a non-violent response to occupation. When we have a violent response, it's either going to result in war, perpetuation of rogue states, perpetuation of rogue extremist groups, and we holistically do not like that. So what is left? An institutional response from within Israel, or a social movement to bring about peace. Now, the institutional response within Israel does not work solely because the institutions are not sufficiently built for that to happen. There are certain laws that institutionalize the occupation further. For example, there's still stop and frisk laws that we know don't work and perpetuate bad sentiments toward the police. Rather, they could have used focused targeting, or even other laws that raising the qualification threshold that don't allow Palestinian minorities to take seats in the parliament. These institutions don't allow for this solution. Thus, there's no better option than BDS, because BDS, we say that now, is moral because it's the most appropriate action towards in the face of the options that we have. Further, BDS is moral because it removes complicity. It removes complicity in the occupation. There is a common good approach introduced by Plato and Aristotle that contends our actions ought to contribute to ethical communal life. And since we established that occupation is bad, and BDS is the only response, our civil societal duty towards that is contributing to common good, and we ought to engage. We are obliged to engage in BDS because it's the only way to move forward and lift the occupation. We've also seen that BDS is moral because it's brought the debate to the front stage. We've seen more academic literature and scholarship being produced because of BDS. And let's face it, we are here all gathered in this room today to discuss and have a dialogue because of BDS. Thank you.
I thank Mr. AZZAWI for his remarks, and we will now turn to Professor Pearl for his response.
I want to preempt my remarks by confessing that I was born in Israel, in Tel Aviv, less than a century ago. And I can't tell you how proud I am to wake up every morning and to remember that I was educated and brought up in this country that contributed so much to this world and to humanity, more than all her detractors put together. I've not spoken to this club before, and I'm doing it today because it is a historical moment, at least in a microcosm of UCLA. For more than 10 years now, we have been witnessing BDS supporters roaming the campus with their megaphones and their slander machines, accusing Israel for everything imaginable, from colonialism to apartheid to child molesting, accusing, and accusing. Today, for the first time in the history of UCLA, we see BDS itself on the accused bench with its small character, its immoral ideology, and anti-peace stance brought to trial. The BDS is not a new phenomenon. It is a brainchild of Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, who in April of 1936 founded the Arab rejectionist movement, and the first thing he did was to launch a boycott against a Jewish agricultural product and a general strike against, I'm finished? 7 minutes? No. Okay. Against Jewish immigration from Europe. The charter of the rejectionist movement in 1936 was very, very similar to the BDS co-founder Omar Barghouti presented here at UCLA on January 15, 2014. Jews are not entitled to any form of self-determination in any part of Palestine, not even the size of a postage stamp. End of discussion. This is where BDS earns in distinct immoral character, denying one people the right that is given to others. It's a blatant discrimination on the basis of national identity. This rejectionist ideology has dominated Arab mindset from 1936 to this very day. BDS is only a symptom. And this rejectionism explains why Abbas spends so much time at UNESCO trying to deny Jewish history. It explains why Palestinian children sing there is no such thing in Israel as Israel, and why their hosts and educators on the official PA television applaud them with bravo, bravo. It also explains why the Israeli peace camp find it so hard to convincing the rest of the Israeli society that despite what they see and watch on PA television, yes, there is a partner. There is still a partner for peace. They haven't produced one. The Mufti boycott of 1936 scored one major victory for the Palestinians. The British government succumbed to mass Arab unrest and prevented Jewish refugees from entering Palestine. My grandfather and grandmother were among those seeking refuge. They perished in Auschwitz in 1942. This victory, unfortunately, was the one and only victory that Arab rejectionism has brought around. For 8 decades, rejectionism led the Palestinian people from one disaster to the other, to another, missing out on Palestinian state in 1937, Peel's Commission, and in 1948, bringing about the genocidal attack on Israel and the Nakba in 1948, and missing out on all other offers, land for peace and so on. Today, yeah? Louder. Oh. Today, better? Today, rejectionism is the main obstacle to the two-state solution. No country can come to life that seeks the elimination of its neighbors. I'll repeat it. No country can come to life that seeks the elimination of its neighbors. Back to the moral side of rejectionism. The BDS Omar Barghouti at UCLA proclaimed Jews are not a people. I believe racism is one criterion by which we should judge the question before us, is BDS moral? I would like to move now to the aims and tactics of the BDS movement. The leaders of BDS never hide their aim, their real purpose. In every conversation with them, they admit that the ultimate goal is not to end the occupation, and surely not to promote peace and coexistence, but to delegitimate Israel in the international arena, isolate her, and eventually bring about her collapse. What most people fail to realize is BDS is not even interested in boycott. It knows that boycott achieves no meaningful level of success. Show me one respectable university that would go along with this childish anti-academic idea. 100 university presidents and chancellors came out immediately in opposition of a boycott. And just last week, we saw all 50 US governors deploring BDS as incompatible with American values. Not only with academic values, with American values. So, if not boycott, what are they trying to achieve on campus? The idea is to bombard American university with endless stream of anti-Israel resolution. The charges may vary from season to season. The authors may rotate. And it matters not whether a resolution passes or fails, or whether it is condemned or hailed. One minute? The victory lies in having a stage, a microphone, a finger pointing at Israel saying, on trial. The more immediate goal is, of course, bullying pro-existence students and other voices into silence. A common hypocrisy among BDS advocates is to present themselves as innocent critics of Israel policies, when what they have in mind is a one-state solution, a state for all its citizens, and other euphemisms. Noam Chomsky called this strategy hypocrisy crying to heaven. And Norman Finkelstein, not a good friend of Israel, called it a hypocritical, dishonest cult led by dishonest gurus. Okay? I believe everybody in this room would like to find out from BDS supporters how peace can emerge when between two partners, one insists on seeing the other dead, and the other insists on staying alive, no matter how glamorous the coffin. I believe the anti-BDS vision of peace is more realistic. Two-state for two people, equally legitimate and equally indigenous. Let me repeat the last one, because without the last one, you wouldn't have the first and the second. Equally indigenous. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Pearl. We will now turn to Professor Makdisi for his response.
I have a lot to say about the things of which my colleagues and I have already been accused before we even stood up to talk, which is that we're immoral, we're dishonest, and so on and so forth, but I'll skip that and come back to it later. I want to address the main theme of our debate tonight, which is our argument that BDS is moral because it is a time-honored, effective, and nonviolent method for people of goodwill to contest the injustice of states that have proven themselves unresponsive to other modes of persuasion. The full history of injustice in Palestine cannot easily be compressed into a few minutes, but I'll do my best with a basic set of claims, and we can return to them later if you'd like. It was as clear as the early 1920s to Zionist leaders like Ze'ev Jabotinsky that, quote, Zionist colonization in Palestine must either be terminated or carried out in defiance of the will of the native population, unquote. The idea of transferring, getting rid of, the indigenous Palestinian population solidified through the 1930s, that is about 20 years before the war for Palestine actually broke out in earnest. By 1940, Joseph Weitz of the Jewish National Fund was clear that, quote, there is no way but to transfer the Arabs, that is the Palestinians, from here to the neighboring countries, to transfer all of them. Not one village must be left, unquote. David Ben-Gurion, who would go on to become Israel's first prime minister, was equally clear. Quote, we must expel the Arabs and take their places when we have force at our disposal, unquote. There are circumstances in history that justify ethnic cleansing, the leading Israeli historian Benny Morris, himself a committed Zionist, put it in 2004. A Jewish state, he points out, quote, would not have come into being without the uprooting of 700,000 Palestinians. Therefore, it was necessary to uproot them. There was no choice but to expel that population, unquote. And so, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were expelled from their homeland, and they've never been allowed to return since. Thus, it was clear to Zionists from the 1920s, and it remains clear to this day, that expelling hundreds of thousands of people or corralling them into holding pens like Gaza in order to maintain a state with a certain privileged ethnic profile will necessitate perpetual violence. That's what it means to throw out hundreds of thousands of people from their country. They don't walk away willingly. Here's Professor Arnon Sofer of Haifa University, the architect of the separation plan put into effect by Israel in the 2000s. Quote, this is him, and I want you to listen to his words. This is the man who came up with the plan for separation, talking about what separation involves. And I quote, when 2.5 million people live in a closed-off Gaza, it's going to be a human catastrophe. Those people will become even bigger animals than they are today. The pressure on the border is going to be awful. So if we want to remain alive, we will have to kill and kill and kill all day, every day, unquote. The point of all this is not killing for the sake of killing, Sofer says. Rather, quote, it guarantees a Zionist Jewish state with an overwhelming majority of Jews, unquote. It is clear then that the project to create and to maintain a monocultural state in what has, through its history, been a multicultural, multi-religious land necessitates, as even its most ardent advocates themselves admit, the unlimited use of violence. Not only physical violence, it's well known by now that in the territories Israel has been militarily occupying since 1967, it maintains a system of absolute segregation, with the two populations there living separately, attending separate schools, using separate roads, and even subject to two entirely different legal systems. Jewish settlers in the West Bank enjoy the protections of Israeli civil law, whereas Palestinians there are subject to the much harsher provisions of Israeli military law, even if they live in the same space. These are grave breaches of international law, and specifically the Apartheid Convention of 1973, leading major scholars of international law, including Richard Falk and John Dugard, among others, to concur with the findings of an exhaustive 2009 study published by the South Africa Human Sciences Research Council, that Israel's practices in the occupied territories, and I quote, are integrated and complementary elements of an institutionalized and oppressive system of Israeli domination and oppression over the Palestinians as a group, that is, a system of apartheid, unquote. This is now, I think, common knowledge. What is slowly also gaining recognition is the extent of institutionalized discrimination within Israel itself, within its pre-67 borders, which is basically the state that would be left in the two-state solution that we're hearing so much about from the other side. First and foremost, precisely as was the case in South African apartheid, there is no universal category of citizenship and nationality in Israel. For according to the Israeli state and its juridical apparatuses, there is no such thing as an Israeli nation in a secular or non-racial sense, and hence, officially, no such thing as an Israeli nationality as such. As the Israeli High Court put it in a ruling in 1972, which it reiterated in 2013, and I quote, "There is no Israeli nation separate from the Jewish people. The Jewish people is composed not only of those residing in Israel, but of diaspora Jewry also," unquote. As a result, not only Jewish citizens of the state, but all Jews everywhere are considered by the organs of the state on the basis of their racial identity as having Jewish nationality, whereas non-Jews, although they may be citizens of the state, are definitely not members of the nation, that is, all Jews all over the world, whether they want to be affiliated with Israel or not, whose state Israel claims to be. And fundamental rights in Israel, above all access to land and housing, are attendant upon racial identity, that is, nationality, as defined by the state, not the lesser category of mere citizenship. Israel is the only state in the world, to my knowledge, where racially privileged non-citizens have access to rights that are denied to citizens of the state if they happen to be of the wrong ethnicity. As a result, Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel, I'm not talking about the occupied territories, I'm talking about the state within its pre-67 borders. The Jewish and Palestinian citizens of the state live separately largely. They attend different and unequal schools. They have different rights. And they're even prevented by Israeli law from marrying each other in Israel. In Israel, Jews can only marry other Jews. They are prohibited from marrying Muslim and Christian Palestinians. Little wonder, then, that a major new report published by the UN earlier this year concludes that, and I quote, "Israel is guilty of policies and practices that constitute the crime of apartheid as legally defined in instruments of international law," unquote. The only question remains is what to do about this situation of grotesque injustice. 2 decades have accomplished nothing, not just nothing, less than nothing, as my colleagues pointed out. The Israelis have built more settlements in the period under discussion. The US gives billions of dollars in aid to Israel every year, and unlike any other country, grants it carte blanche in the UN, exercising its veto in the Security Council to protect Israel from international censure. In this, as in many other cases where governments have failed to do the right thing to bring about justice, it falls to ordinary people of goodwill to make their own interventions in history. The Montgomery bus boycott of 1955-56 was the first large-scale demonstration against legalized racial discrimination in the United States. It led directly to the desegregation of the Montgomery bus system. Apartheid South Africa enjoyed the strong support of foreign powers, including the US and UK, until a grassroots boycott campaign forced governments to realign their policies and ultimately led to the demise of apartheid in that country. When North Carolina passed a law that discriminated against transgender rights and accessing bathrooms just last year, LGBTQ groups announced a boycott which was ultimately endorsed by the NCAA, and a few months later North Carolina repealed the offensive law. The boycott of Israel is no different. It is aimed not at people or individuals, but at a manifestly unjust political system that is in long-standing contravention of international law. When citizens of goodwill encounter a situation of injustice, they have a choice. They can equivocate, as our colleagues over there are trying to do, and they can turn a blind eye to it, or they can take a stand. To ignore injustice, to look the other way when we see fellow human beings being abused by an unjust government, can never be a moral proposition. To take a stand on the side of justice is always the right and moral thing to do. People arguing against BDS should ask themselves what they would do if Rosa Parks were reaching out to them today. Would they brush past her, defy the boycott, and get on that bus? Or would they hold her hand and join her demand for justice, freedom, and equality? You should think about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Makdisi. Now it's time for question and answer period. The first question comes from the affirmative side. Yes, come to the mic, please.
I have to preface by saying that, sadly, my warning about extremely, egregiously false retelling of reality has been confirmed. And compassion abuse has been confirmed by Professor Makdisi. Every foundational claim in his intervention is false. That there's no Israeli nationality, false. There is a national law that's based on the Turkish millet system that every community gets to rule its own social affairs. There is no Israeli general community. There's a Muslim community, there's a Jewish one, etc., and a Druze one, etc. It's a law that they kept to keep the communities happy, etc., etc., etc. But I want to ask Professor Makdisi, who liked to quote Benny Morris, if he knows about this quote from the New York Review of Books in 2004. I most emphatically never stated anywhere that the dismantling of Palestinian society and the expulsion of 700,000 Palestinians was a deliberate and planned operation intended to cleanse those part of Palestine assigned to the Jews. Quite the opposite. I'm skipping some lines. No systematic policy of expulsion was ever adopted or implemented, hence Israel's 1 million strong Arab minority today. The Arabs have only themselves to blame for the unexpected results of the war that they launched with the aim of ethnically cleansing Palestine of the Jews. Contemporary Arab apologists, always full of righteous indignation, conveniently forget this. I'll add just another quote, asking you, Professor, do you know this quote from Benny Morris from 2010?
Okay, thank you. I think he gets the gist of your question. Professor Makdisi?
I mean, in all honesty, I've taught classes in this room, and I'm not sure that was a question really, but let's indulge the questioner and say that it is. I know that the essays that you're talking about by Benny Morris, and I love the way you're attempting to parse, to play with Benny Morris's own quite slippery words. When it comes to slippery words, let's just say I know a thing or two about how they work. What Benny Morris is saying, the main claim that you're quoting from there is he says that there was no deliberate, premeditated system of ethnic cleansing that the Zionists planned to do, that it kind of happened, it just happened in a way that was not, they didn't really predict it. So all those quotations from Jabotinsky and Ben-Gurion and so on and so forth, the Weitz, et cetera, they weren't premeditated. They were sort of, in fact, I don't know what they were in Morris's own terms. His claim is that they were talking about it and talking about it and talking about it when finally 1948 happened, and as he himself says, there was an ethnic cleansing and 750,000 people were expelled from their homes. According to Benny Morris, it was a coincidence. It wasn't pre-planned. You can accept that argument if you want. To me, it sort of defies belief. And I'm not interested in trading and bandying accusations. I just think it's silly and immature. I'm not labeling the other side, and I'm not calling them extremists and immoral and liars and hypocrites. And I'm not doing that. I have no interest in doing that. In fact, I'm sure they're not. I'm sure they're perfectly nice people. But that's not the issue. What you've heard about tonight is a kind of division, and using very, very, very emotive language about suicide and so on and so forth. The clear distinction here is an argument that is predicated on equality and justice for all, which is what we're advocating, as opposed to the separation of peoples, which is exactly what they're advocating. So we in this country, in the United States of America, know about the history of the separation of peoples. It does not produce justice. It produces, in fact, injustice. So what we're coming back to is a way of trying to find a way forward that allows both peoples to live together, that we agree, but as equals, as equal citizens of a state that treats all of its citizens equally. Personally, as an American, I don't see what's so wrong with that. They clearly think that a state that treats all of its citizens equally is somehow problematic or involves suicide and so on and so forth, using other emotive language, which I really just find silly, personally. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Makdisi. It is now the turn of the pro-BDS side to ask a question to the anti-BDS side. So, I invite Wali to come to the podium.
So can this question be just levied to the whole side, or should it be directed at a particular individual?
The whole side, an individual, sure.
Sure. So I guess the question that I have is that, I guess sort of piggybacking off of what the professors actually both mentioned, that the BDS movement seems to entail, or there's a belief that the BDS movement entails necessarily the doing away with Israel. Is there a way, like, is that something that is believed to be mutually exclusive with ending the occupation and also ensuring a just solution to the refugee problem, as well as ensuring equality for non-Jewish citizens of Israel? Is that something that is totally out of the question under the framework of what the BDS argument is? And this is open for.
Yes. I invite Professor Pearl to the podium.
We have a mic here that we can use. Okay,
Oh,
podium.
yes, this one. It's total. Whenever I talked about BDS and I say they really want the demise of Israel, people ask me, really? We never heard that. And I have to prove it to them. Today we had the proof. You heard Professor Makdisi, okay? Talking again and again why Israel shouldn't exist. It commits so many crimes. It has so many blemishes. You can't even get married if you don't marry a Jew. It's full of criminal activities, which means it shouldn't exist, right? So here he provides the proof that BDS is defined itself by through the elimination of Israel. No, I see some heads moving horizontally. No, they would allow the state to be called maybe Israel and be a state for all its people. Namely, a state for all its people, including the West Bank, means the majority is Arab, means that the immigration policy is dictated by the authority, by the Arabs, and will bring in as many Arab refugees or descendants of refugees as they wish, which means no more Jewish majority, which means that the Jewish minority is hereby condemned for eternal statelessness, unable to protect itself on their own by the power of a sovereignty. That's what it means. Well, I wouldn't like to leave my sister to the mercy of BDS benevolence, okay, to be protected from the violence and the genocidal tendency that we see today in the Middle East. We should be a little bit practical. Jews would like to defend themselves, and as a matter of fact, as a practical matter, they will not let they will fight to the nails, okay, to keep that, two privileges, and that one to defend themselves, the second one to determine the immigration policy.
Thank you. That ends our cross-examination period. It's now time to hear the closing remarks. We'll first hear a 3-minute closing rebuttal from Professor Pearl. Your turn.
So after we heard the proof here that BDS defines itself, but I see again, heads are moving horizontal. No, as I said, they will let Israel call itself Israel, but they'll change its character to the degree that Jews will, as a minority, will become minority. You would admit that. And which is not too bad, you know. Some religious minority live quite well in other countries. But Jews happen to be more than a religion minority. They are a nation. They are a civilization. They are a people. That is what BDS cannot get to their mind. That we have a history, and I am indigenous in this country. I am indigenous, although my parents came from Poland in 1924. Because I speak a language that was spoken in that land before any Palestinian could say Sabah al-Khair or I speak the language that was spoken in that land before any Palestinian could say Salam alaikum. And my role models, my authors that I admire, have written their works in this land before any Palestinian author even wrote Arabic. I celebrate holidays. Okay? after events that happened in this land, not in England or in Germany where you want to send me to. Therefore, we are indigenous, and until the BDS movement can get it to their head that they are dealing with equally indigenous people here, there will not be any peace. And I would like now to continue and correct few mistakes that my colleague, Dr. Makdisi, has mentioned about the early days of Zionism and the ideas of transfer and Jabotinsky. I read the original of Jabotinsky, and I read the original, I still have it on my shelf, if you want the first edition. Let me start with Ben-Gurion. In 1917, he published a paper in New York in Yiddish, and he said, the Palestinian Falachins are our brothers. These are descendants of our ancestor, the Jews who were displaced after the Bar Kokhba rebellion by the Romans and decided to convert to first Christianity and then Islam in order to keep their land. So there is a lot of Jewish blood in the Palestinians. Let's treat them as our brothers. These are our brethren. That was Ben-Gurion in 1917, 2 months before the Balfour Declaration. And then in 1931, he made a speech in front of the Hebrew Union, and he said, there is a thing in the world, and I quote because I keep on repeating it and quoting it, there is a thing in the world called self-determination. And we have fought for these principles everywhere, for all people except ourselves. Now there is evidence that there is a desire for self-determination of our brothers, of the Palestinians. We should join them in their struggle, even if it compromises some of the aspirations of the Zionist movement. This is Ben-Gurion in 1931. I have the original. I don't read what Benny Morris or others say about Ben-Gurion. I read that, and there's a difference here. This Ben-Gurion speech was published in Hebrew. It was penetrated the school that I grew up on, the kindergarten. Everybody knew that. I remember my teacher tells me, thou shalt not talk like that against Arabs. Today they are our enemy, tomorrow they are our neighbors. This is how Israeli society was educated. All these ideas about transfer were marginal and marginalized by the institution of the Zionist movement. Zangwill, the first one who said land without land without people to people without land, okay? He was exorcised from the Zionist movement. The moment he uttered those words, those people did not enter into the mainstream culture. The thing that got institutionalized was the Zionist movement. Welcome, let's fight the British together. And that was rejected. I finished.
Thank you, Professor Pearl. We'll give equal time to Professor Makdisi for his rebuttal.
One is struggling to know where to begin exactly, but okay. What you see here is, I'm not going to go through the reconstructions of history. I ask you to consider, well, read the books yourselves, for one thing. And you can consider what it would mean, why 750 or 800,000 Palestinians would have left their homes. What does it mean to leave your home? Under what circumstances would you, think about yourselves, would you get up and leave your homes? And even if you did, what is the force that it would take to stop you from returning to your home? Home is the most fundamental value we have as human beings. what it means to be at home, what it means to belong somewhere, what it means to want to return to your home. The passionate language that Professor Pearl has been using to talk about his own attachment to the land should enable him to understand why a Palestinian like me, whose mother was born in Jerusalem, whose grandfather was born in Jerusalem, whose great-grandfather was born in Jerusalem, whose name, Makdisi, means of Jerusalem, also might have an attachment to Jerusalem. It's not something that goes, wow, how could he have this other attachment? What's going on here is very simple. Nowhere have I said, and I do not believe, that Palestinian rights negate Jewish rights, but I also don't believe that Jewish rights negate Palestinian rights. So, we have two people crammed together in one not very big piece of land. They're mixed together, even if there's a two-state solution, which seems incredibly unlikely because the territory that would have been a Palestinian state has been built up onto the point where there can't be such a state any longer. Even if there were, that would leave still 1.5 million, about 20% of Israel's population within pre-67, the Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel, at the mercy of a state that considers itself legally to be the Jewish state, which also shouldn't be a surprise. Think about that. What does it mean when a state says it's going to be a Jewish state? What does it mean to be a Muslim state or a Christian state or a white state? It means that you have to belong to whatever that category is of ethnicity or race or religion or whatever it is in order to feel a full member of that state. And if you're not, well, guess what? You're going to have second or third or fifth class status. That's what it means to have an exclusive state, not just Jewish, it doesn't matter, Muslim, Christian, white, whatever. That's what it means. So what you're seeing here fundamentally is a clash between people on this side of the room who are saying, we believe in justice and equality for all. And on the other hand, people who are saying there is an exclusive right that, we might slice off a little piece of it, 22% of historical Palestine, and give that to them to have, but we're going to keep 78% of the land for ourselves, and then we're going to call that equality. And as I said, anyway, that doesn't address the rights of the Palestinians who live within the so-called Jewish state, right? It doesn't address the rights of people who were expelled from their homes, who have a moral and legal right to return to their land. I know that would invalidate the carefully managed demographic balance of the state of Israel. The question is, why is it so appalling to think of a country in which different peoples, different religions, different backgrounds, different ethnicities live and work together and love each other also, legally, not illegally the way it is now? What's wrong with people from different backgrounds sharing a country? Palestinians also have rights. Palestinians also have long fought for a state of their own. Thinking about a state in which Jews and Palestinians, or Israelis and Palestinians, live together as equals involve both peoples recognizing the right of each other and saying, we're not going to have our own unique private state anymore. It's not going to happen. We're going to have to find a way to live together. And in creating that kind of a state, we're talking about not national suicide or destruction or annihilation. You can use that florid language if you want to, but you can also think about it as a state of many cultures, many ethnicities, in a land that, if you read the Old Testament, has always had many peoples in it. From the beginning, it's always been a land of many cultures. The idea that you can take it and make it a state of one people and not others is, as I quoted all those Zionist thinkers and practitioners and historians and so on and so forth, they've told you in their own words what it means. It means violence. So you can ascribe to violence if you want. That's what it takes to have an exclusive state in a multicultural land. Or you can say, let's compromise. They love compromise. Let's compromise. We compromise by saying everybody's right is the same. We have to find a way to balance those rights in one land and live together as equals. I would be happy, as a Palestinian, to share a state with Jewish people. The contrary does not seem to be true, not as equals anyway. I mean, a few here and there they'll tolerate, but full equality. You heard the language about, oh my God, the Arabs will outnumber us, or oh my God, Jews will become a minority. What's so bad with being a minority?
In the Middle East?
Yeah.
Order, please. Order, please.
This country, the one that we're in now, This city, the city that we're in now, is a city and a country of minorities. There's nothing wrong with people sharing values, sharing land, working together. The attempt to say a state should have a purely ethnic identity of this ethnicity and not that ethnicity, there's never in the history of the world been such a state that survived without violence. It is predicated on violence. It will always involve violence. So the choice is then a choice between violence and between peace and equality and justice. And BDS ultimately is not about all these crazy things. It's about rights as defined in international law. We all have human rights. The law says what our rights are. You can gallop over them if you want to. You can ignore them. You can turn a blind eye to them. Or you can acknowledge what those rights are and try to find a way to resolve this situation in such a way that everybody's rights equally are given justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Makdisi. Is Insia in the house?
Sorry, Professor Miller? I
Yes.
believe Professor Makdisi went above the time given to Professor Pearl. May I use that time?
Excuse me?
1 minute?
No, both of them, Professor Cole was talking for 6 minutes as well. And
It was both 6 minutes?
Yeah, both
Okay.
6
Sorry.
minutes.
All right,
yeah.
no problem.
I gave the same time to Professor.
Okay.
Okay, now it's time that you've all been waiting for. I call on the gentleman in the Insia, the gentleman in the silver sweater in the middle there. Can you wait for the microphone, sir, and the camera? Yeah, Sam, go up. Oh, yeah. I'm sorry, a little technical difficulty.
Thank you very much. I have a question for both sides. Palestinians are not integrated into Arab societies and kept in terrible camps in many Arab countries such as Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. They are deprived of voting rights and other rights such as being members of the Supreme Court and members of parliament like they are in Israel. In Syria, more Palestinians have died than in Israel. What does it mean that there is no BDS movement against Syria to protect the Palestinians?
Okay, let's start with the government side. What does that mean?
I don't like the government. What I want to say is that Professor Makdisi says he wants a state that it treats all its citizens equally without regard to race, religion, ethnicity. That makes him a Zionist, because the only state in the Middle East, the only state from Morocco to Pakistan that treats all of its citizens equally under the law is Israel.
The negative side, your response? Why is there not I believe the question is, why is there not a BDS aimed at other countries that have equal human rights violations? Is that the essence of your question? Palestinian, yes.
Why is
Yes.
there not BDS against Syria? You may want to take a look at newspapers, but there's been a lot going on in Syria recently. The country's falling apart.
Insia, you have your mic back? Okay. Excuse me?
No, I had to respond a second for that.
Okay.
What you described here is the situation in the Arab state, how they treat the Palestinians.
Microphone.
The answer to your question, this is exactly why Jews do not like to be minority in the Middle East. Just look at the way they treated Palestinians in Syria and other places. It's very nice to quote Isaiah and say, if only the wolf would live with the sheep. It will be very nice. But unfortunately, we have a Middle East to deal with for at least the next 300 years. And we have to look for the immediate situation.
Okay, let's take another question. That gentleman
Oh,
looks
wait.
very anxious to ask a question in the blue. Yes, sir. What's our time?
Hi, guys. It's a pleasure being here. It's a question for both sides. If Israel is a Jewish nation, right, a Jewish state, then that's made up of majority Jewish people, is being anti-Israel being anti-Semite?
Okay. Why don't we start with Wally? You want to take that one?
Yeah, I suppose the term like anti-Israel is worth defining a little more. But in short, no, that opposing policies of government, in terms of opposing policies of a government that does not necessarily entail being against the religious, I guess, composition of that state. So I would say no. There's obviously cases to be made, like there's a huge contingency of folks, I'm sure, that view anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, but that too can be debated. So if that's what you mean by anti-Israel, well, I'm sure there's responses on both sides that would argue one way or another.
Affirmative?
The answer to the question is worse. Being anti-Israel is worse than being anti-Semitic. And you know why? Because we Jews are expert in handling anti-Semitism. Okay? We have developed an antibodies. We are still bewildered at the new kind of anti-Jewishness, which goes under anti-Zionism. And therefore it is worse. It's the worst form of racism. It denies a people the right for homeland, right, on the basis of national identity. Right. It is a form of racism, but it is protected where anti-Semitism already gathered tradition and people resentment against it.
Yes, ma'am, in the blue. You're welcome. Could you wait for the mic, please?
Oh, I can speak very loud without having principal's voice. First of all, I appreciate what everybody said, and if I hadn't had my own experiences of my parents being in the Holocaust and myself spending 3.5 years in a displacement camp, kicked out of my homeland, not able to go back, and after being in Germany just a couple of days ago and seeing the history of Jews being kicked out of everywhere, there is no home. Where is our home? First of all, Palestinians are Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Tell me if in 1948, when they divided and gave that little piece of nothing to Israel, and gave Transjordan to the Palestinians and the rest.
We want a question in this, please. Okay.
Where is there, isn't that a homeland for them? What is the matter with giving that little piece to the Jews who had no place to go over all those years?
Thank you. Professor Makdisi, you want to start?
I'm honestly baffled by the anger in your voice.
I feel it.
It's evident that you do.
Like yours was, okay.
I'm not angry.
You came across angry and belligerent to the other group. You attacked.
Listen.
Okay, one more time. Okay, let's let him respond to your question about the little slice.
I don't want a pizza. Really, what I want is for people to live together in such a way that we don't have to worry about minorities and majorities, that we can find a way to live in a multi-ethnic, multi-religious country with many ethnicities. For me, as an American citizen, that's something I value. If you don't value it, that's up to you. I've answered your question, madam.
I think we
Okay.
should stick to the, madam, I think we should stick to the
Sorry,
format.
one question, that's the rule.
Wait, I'd like to get our turn to respond.
Yes, we get the affirmative response.
Okay, so first of all, I'm baffled at the level of abject dishonesty coming from the other side, from a professor who should know better. I taught the class on the Palestinian exodus of 1948. I encourage you all to go read Benny Morris's book. All the other scholars, from Norma Sala and Rashid Khalidi to Ilan Pape, based their account on his research. The Palestinians were wildly, the wild proportion of Palestinians, the great majority, left because their elites broke down and left before the fighting had even reached their cities. Only 10 to 15% were expelled. It is a tragic number, but similar numbers of Jews were expelled, and they were expelled as part of a war for survival. Second, talking about minorities in the Middle East, let's talk about Palestinians. The proportion of Palestinians among Christian Palestinians has collapsed under the Palestinian Authority. I think there's a reduction in 95% of the Christians who live there. They've been forced to flee. The only place in the Middle East where it is safe to be, even a Muslim, or a Christian, or let alone a Jew, gay, transgender, anything, is in Israel, because it is the only state that adheres to liberal values. We have to end this nonsense where we're being preached to by people who defend either directly or indirectly the Palestinian Authority, or even Hamas by calling it resistance, preaching to Israel about how to be democratic. The only state anybody here would be safe in the Middle East is Israel right now. And if you want to see what a state of quote unquote all its citizens looks like in the Middle East, except for Israel, it's Syria. That's what happens when you have different large groups that are living side by side in the Middle East, and it's
Okay.
not in Israel.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Sarah had a question.
Very briefly, may I just add a 10-second note? Yeah, so I think one other point that was mentioned in the first couple speeches was that the fundamental issue is not necessarily just about, it's not necessarily existence of the state, but it's more so the political realities that have resulted from it. So if there's a way to resolve those, I mean, I'm sure that's what any sort of peace process focuses on, at least some kind of compromise. But yeah, that's certainly a sticky situation.
Thank you.
For sure.
Let's go on to Sarah, please.
Hi, I have two questions actually, and you can respond to either.
You get one. So,
or both.
So
Okay.
choose one for both sides.
Mine is about the practicality and effectiveness of BDS. If the goal is withdrawal from the territories, the occupied territories, namely the West Bank, how do you know that what happened in Gaza won't happen again?
Okay. Joe, you have been kind of quiet.
Sure.
If the goal is withdrawal from the territories, namely the West Bank, how do you know that what happened in Gaza won't happen again?
So I think that if you are an Israeli citizen, that's certainly your concern, is how do you make sure that what happened historically when you withdrew from certain territories doesn't happen again? And so I think the solution is that that has to happen inside the context of a broader two-state solution deal, where you have some sort of unified Palestinian government, not a feud between Hamas, Fatah, the PA, but a unified government that can agree to demilitarize a certain portion of what would be considered a Palestinian state. I think if you don't have that, you're very likely to, or at least Israelis would be very likely to think that you would have some sort of militant movement in the West Bank. And whether or not that's justified, I think that their right to determine their own self-defense, given that they've had rockets fired at them from every which way, is something that should be taken very seriously.
Just add something. There's one component that Joseph forgot. It's not enough to...
Only one answer.
There is a way to guarantee that, but it's not by signing agreement, it's through education. As long as the Palestinians do not educate their children for peace, it will repeat itself.
Okay, Insia, I recognize the lady in the black. Where?
They get a response.
Oh, your response, okay, response.
So yeah, I guess ensuring that it doesn't turn out to be like a situation where a militant group wins. So I would imagine that the Palestinian Authority has more control over the West Bank than they did of Gaza. I mean, I'm sure like the contiguousness of it matters, but yeah, I do think that like if it were to occur under the framework of a like two-state solution, there would probably accompany some form of like demilitarization or something along those lines. But again, to point to the one source that we mentioned in our, I believe, second speech, that there was a study about the removal of a series of checkpoints that was put out in the American Journal of, I think, Political Science, something like that, that measured that the decrease in such security measures actually improved sentiments of Palestinians towards Israelis, or at least Palestinians like within who were initially subject to those checkpoints. They had much more positive views of reconciliation and seeking, I guess, like a political solution and promoting like a compromised, a peaceful solution, pretty much. So it's something that is not, I think, inevitable as many people might fear it to be, for it to devolve into something more violent. So.
Okay, I saw the woman in the black here had a question. Yes, please.
I feel like there's a big discrepancy between definitions, and so you guys keep talking about a Jewish democracy, and Dr. Makdisi kind of already addressed it, but I just want no like opinions. I just want a flat-out definition from you guys what you think a democracy is and how you define racism.
Okay, that has to be answered by both sides, you
Yeah.
understand? Okay.
I just want, yeah,
So
from both
the
sides.
question is, what's democracy? What is racism?
The Jewish state is Jewish by virtue of having a Jewish majority. It doesn't have an official religion. It is Jewish in the way that Japan is Japanese. A democracy is a country that protects every citizen equally under the law and gives them the right to vote, to free expression, to be protected from discrimination on the basis of race, gender, sex, sexual orientation, all these things. In other words, Israel.
Yes. Professor Makdisi?
What was the question again? Define democracy. Do you define democracy? First of all, I don't think you can have an exclusive democracy. I think that's an oxymoron, but basically by definition. So democracy is a state that treats all of its citizens equally and empowers all citizens equally in the transaction of political decision making, essentially. And racism is a structure that basically doesn't allow that to happen. So if you have a state that is a state for one people only, that claims to treat everybody else equally, even though it's really for one state, what you have is an oxymoron in action. And you can believe that a state that's only for one people is actually also for everybody else, but logically speaking, either it's for one people or it's for everybody. It can't be both at the same time.
Well, I'm afraid our time for questions and answers. Oh, you're pointing at this lady here. Okay, I guess by a house acclaim, we want to extend the question and answers for a little while longer. Is that the desire of the house? Okay, we'll go 5 more minutes, Pratik. Yes, ma'am. I just love your smile. Yes.
Thank you.
Could you
Well, I want to start off. Can you hear me? Yeah. I want to start off by saying
would you mind standing?
I'm against the occupation also. But in order to be against the occupation, you also have to solve certain problems. Why is there an occupation? And what I would like to know is, how does BDS solve anything? To me, it says, stop doing this, but it doesn't solve any problems. It doesn't tell you what needs to happen in order for the two people to live together in peace. By telling professors, American professors, boycott Israeli professors because they're in Israel. By telling dancers all over the world, boycott Israel dancers. That doesn't solve anything at all. So my question is, how does BDS solve anything at all?
Well, Joe?
So I think the response is that BDS would argue that they are putting pressure on Israel by declaring that they will not negotiate, they will not host any Israeli academics, and that it will, argue that nor should any decently thinking person do that. I think what that doesn't allow for is a dialogue, right? So I think ultimately the only conclusion that's going to lead to a two-state solution, or any sort of solution that is agreeable to the majority of people, is going to have to include dialogue, is going to have to include compromise. And BDS is antithetical to both of those things in the sense that it already preordains that one side, because of their national origin, if they are Israeli or part of any Israeli institution, that they are automatically wrong. I think, first of all, that's untrue, but second of all, even if that is the case, you're going to want to talk with that person and try and convince them. Because at the end of the day, there's no amount of pressure that you could put on the state of Israel that has existed for as long as it has now, that has become as strong as it has. There's no amount of pressure that you could put on them that I think is going to ultimately lead them to give up what's in their own national interest. What you have seen historically is that they do want to compromise. They have offered peace deals. Those have been rejected and followed up with violence by Palestinian militant organizations.
Okay, the negative side, would you like to respond to the question that what does BDS accomplish in a pragmatic sense?
Yeah, so I think, I guess just to take a step back, the nature of this debate was certainly a value debate about the morality associated with it. I guess if we were taking a more policy-oriented approach, we would have had a very interesting discussion to that effect. But in a sense that, like, BDS, it certainly, its goal is to put pressure, but it's not necessarily meant to achieve any situation. It could perhaps, potentially, I don't know if it will, but it could, it's not necessarily meant to achieve a unilateral solution necessarily. Maybe it will, maybe it might. But the idea behind it is that it imposes cost that it's because of the nature of Israel being the occupier in the situation, like having won over all of the land in the 1967 war, it holds more power in its hand to make measurable changes, as in it has more room, I suppose, to have any measurable effect in the situation, simply because of the power dynamic. So in terms of what BDS accomplishes, the goal is really the same as what any sort of peace process might hope to, in terms of ensuring equality and whatnot. It's just a kind of a parallel means of getting there, I suppose. So it hasn't really yet. I mean, I guess that's why we're talking about it. But yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That concludes the question and answer period. We will have an opportunity at our reception to engage the speakers in a further dialogue, I hope, that it's civil and engages in questions and not ad hominem. I would be remiss if I did not thank the members of the UCLA Debate Union, its staff, for helping put this on. They worked their fannies off. You saw them checking you in, holding the mics, doing the cameras, doing everything, making this happen, and I'm very grateful to them for doing that. I hope you'll join us out this door for a little reception where we can continue the, hopefully, civil dialogue. Thank you for coming.